The 1994 film Stargate begins with an archaeological dig in Giza, Egypt in 1928. A young girl, Catherine Langford, finds a golden medallion with the image of the sun god Ra. Actually, it's Horus, but they call it Ra, so might as well call it Ra. And instead of giving it to the Egyptian historians, she is allowed to keep it as a souvenir. They also find an alien portal device. And in the director's cut, they also find what appear to be fossilized aliens shaped like the half-animal Egyptian god Anubis. 66 years later, Catherine approaches Dr. Daniel Jackson.
James Spader.
He needs to call me.
An Egyptologist laughed out of academia for his assertion that Egyptians received help from some unknown source, implied to be aliens. That the Egyptians themselves could not build the pyramids. Which is... yeah. And she makes him an offer to help translate some hieroglyphs for the US government. He has no other hope for his career and is practically homeless, so he really has to accept. To use terminology from Joseph Campbell's dissection of the hero's journey, she represents the call to adventure. Many female calls to adventure are sexualized, so as to seduce the male hero onwards. Examples include Trinity in The Matrix and Mirage in The Incredibles. The Disney film Atlantis: The Lost Empire, which shares a lot of similarity to Stargate, also chose to have femme fatale Helga Sinclair extend the invitation of adventure to our hero. With that in mind, I think it's a more feminist step to have Daniel's call to adventure come from a completely non-sexualized older woman who comes off as a sort of female Obi-Wan Kenobi. The late Viveka Lindfors injects a quiet, curious dignity to her role that makes the character come out as more respectful than usual female calls to adventure. Daniel is taken to an Air Force base inside of a mountain, where he joins two other archaeologists, a man, Dr. Gary Myers, and a woman, Dr. Barbara Shore, in addition to Catherine. He is shown the cover stones of the Egyptian Stargate tomb, with some hieroglyphics and other mysterious symbols on it. Gary protests when Daniel immediately takes charge and rewrites his translation. Gary did all of this work, and Daniel upstages him in a macho show of his geeky prowess. And the female geeks can only cheer on this new dominant male geek. Daniel is a figure for geek fantasy fulfillment. Whereas most male heroes are physically imposing and have power through physical strength, Daniel's power comes from his intellect. He defeats obstacles and becomes victorious through thinking about things. His conflict with Colonel Jack O'Neill, who shows up in a moment, can be summed up as geek versus jock.
I've just got a little problem with scientists.
So when Daniel comes in and displays his intellect, this is our hero displaying his power. This is like Wolverine cage fighting. We identify with Daniel and find his defeat of the established champion empowering. I am perfectly alright with Daniel being stronger than the other scientists, but I do wish the female scientist did something other than look back and forth between the two competing males. If Gary and Barbara had worked on the translation together and together argued with Daniel, I'd be fine. O'Neill shows up to restrict Daniel's access to classified information, and the film takes a breather. Daniel eventually uses his geeky prowess to interpret the unknown symbols as representing constellations, used as points of reference for some kind of alien wormhole. When he presents his findings, he expects no one to believe him, but O'Neill allows him access to the Stargate, which the military has been trying to activate. They were unsuccessful because they didn't have the final reference point to indicate point of origin, but Daniel figures it out and they manage to activate it. They send a probe through and find a place similar to Earth. Daniel claims that if he is included on a mission through the ring, he could take them back to Earth, so they put him on the mission. The unit is composed entirely of men. I'm not sure it matters highly with regard to the issue of women in the military, but it certainly sets the tone as masculine. It's a masculine fantasy similar to Avatar, but for geeks instead of jocks. Catherine gives him the Eye of Ra necklace to keep him safe. They show off their effects for a while, and then have the team get spit out on a world that will eventually be referred to as Abydos, a desert planet with the Stargate housed in what looks like an Egyptian pyramid. Daniel wants to go exploring, but the mission is limited. The point is just to make contact and then go home. Problem is, Daniel assumed there would be a cartouche like the one found on Earth to indicate the address to dial home, and without this, they're stuck. This causes some jock versus geek hate, and the soldiers torment him for a bit until Daniel comes upon an alien yak thing. There's a slight diversion with the yak, then they find this human settlement built into a mining operation. Daniel uses his geeky power to make contact with the native Abydonians. who see his necklace and assume he comes as a representative of Ra. So they worship him and his people as something like Egyptian angels. They get to know everyone and start to make friends. O'Neill, whose young son accidentally shot himself, makes friends with a native boy named Skara. No, not Scarro, Skara. While Daniel makes friends with the chief. He tries to ask him about symbols, but the chief indicates that writing is forbidden, so that inquiry goes nowhere. The chief gives his daughter Shaori to Daniel as a gift. Daniel handles the situation in a pretty decent feminist way. He initially tries to reject the offering until he sees that it would cause her significant social damage, and he instead just pretends to accept her as a gift while he doesn't touch her and treats her as a person.
And so my watch begins.
I think it may not have gone the same way if they weren't aiming at geeks over jocks. Daniel is allowed to display a civility that might not fly as well if he had to display his masculinity through physical prowess. We can again compare to Avatar, where Jake Sully uses tribal rules to assert his claim over his love interest, to whom he feels personally entitled. Daniel is given more space to consider what is morally and ethically right. Daniel has more luck asking Shaori about the symbols. She takes him to a cavern where he finds a story explaining how the humans got there. There was a dying alien named Ra, and he needed to infest a host body in order to stay alive. He found Earth and infested a courageous young boy who approached him without fear. He ruled the Egyptians as a tyrant and used the Stargate to have humans mine an explosive metal, later referred to as Naquadah, for him on Abydos. But there was an uprising on Earth and the Stargate was buried, keeping Ra on the Abydos side. They find some of the symbols, but are missing the all-important point of origin. Meanwhile, Ra's spaceship lands on the pyramid. What appear to be half-animal aliens attack the soldiers waiting at the gate. When Daniel and O'Neill show up to investigate, they are captured and brought before Ra, played by the androgynous Jay Davidson, best known for his role as the trans woman in The Crying Game. While there is some mythological basis for Ra being androgynous, the creators clearly have no respect for Egyptian myth and are just doing whatever the hell they want. Which means I can criticize their main villain coming off as like an evil gay man, surrounding himself with beautiful children like the victims of his pedophilia. It's very similar to the depiction of King Xerxes in 300, showing a feminine man as villainous in contrast to our masculine heroes, albeit in a geek fantasy and not a jock fantasy. O'Neill attacks him and Daniel is killed in the process. Ra's child servants form a human shield and O'Neill can't bring himself to fire. Ra locks up O'Neill and, because he sees Daniel wears the mark of a Ra worshipper, decides to revive him and let him be Ra's servant. Ra reveals that O'Neill brought an atomic bomb with them to Abydos. It was a secret suicide mission where O'Neill, who was suicidal as a result of grief over his son, would keep the deadly aliens from coming through the Stargate to Earth. Ra sees it as an attempt on his life and intends to respond by augmenting it with Naquadah and sending it to Earth to wipe out humanity there, or at least send humanity back to the Stone Age. As an aside, I am pretty sure that Roland Emmerich was depicting Ra flirting with Daniel. Roland Emmerich is a gay man, but not very principled. He doesn't tend to depict gay men in the best light, and that comes out with Ra. On the other hand, there is a bit of flirtation with the concept of two men engaging in flirtation. Also, Ra is kind of like an allusion to God, so as wacky racist as it is, it's kind of a bold attempt to criticize the Abrahamic God through the metaphor of Ra. Similar to the depiction of Gozer in Ghostbusters, who also has that androgynous look. Just food for thought.
Is it Jacob?
He tells Daniel to prove his devotion by killing O'Neill at a public execution. Daniel, of course, refuses and turns and attacks. Fortunately, the Abydonian boys, led by Skara, attack and rescue them. They retreat to a cave. O'Neill has to accept that Skara has a right to try and defend his people, and O'Neill can't let his regret over his son keep Skara from becoming a warrior. So we have this father-son relationship between them, a very masculine focus on that side of the group. Meanwhile, Daniel receives criticism from the tribe because he's doing work that they feel should be relegated to his wife. This positions the jock-geek conflict in a masculine-feminine context. Daniel's general awkwardness and feelings of exclusion from the group, characteristic of his geek role, are now associated with femininity, and his struggle to prove sufficient masculinity is synonymous with his efforts to be accepted by the jocks, who represent a masculine ideal ascribed to by society. The film in general caters to the idea that geeks are better than jocks, but it now has Daniel, shall we say, ascend to a higher position in the social hierarchy by asserting masculinity and consummating his marriage with Shaori. The way this happens is that he goes to ask her why they think that he's married to her, and she indicates that she was too ashamed to tell them that he rejected her. I'm a little confused because it seems like we're going over the same material as the previous scene, but that's how the movie goes. Daniel decides to show her that he doesn't mean her any disrespect by asserting his masculinity and becoming her husband. The film, and later the series, seems to think that Daniel's initial hesitation in assuming the role of husband makes this relationship feminist enough, but I disagree because the second scene changes nothing about our understanding of the relationship. It's still a woman being given to a man as tribute to keep the sun god from killing people, even if she is still inclined to fulfill her wifely duties after seeing that Daniel doesn't worship Ra, and having an idea of who and what Ra is, and even if Daniel respects women as equals, there's no indication that she views herself as an equal with equal rights and ability to consent to anything, which means that Daniel shouldn't take her yes as particularly meaningful. In contrast, 1632 by Eric Flint, a one-way time travel story about year 2000 Americans going to 1632 Germany, has great emphasis on the local women being made to appreciate their innate human rights before the Americans can legitimately engage in romantic relationships with them. If Shaori were depicted as a stronger person who Daniel talked to a bit about feminism, this could work, but it's just an Avatar-like male fantasy of getting with the chieftain's hot daughter without that kind of focus on human rights, and thus is exploitative fiction. Well, Daniel figures out the symbol, and now it's just a matter of overthrowing Ra and securing the Stargate. They go to the Abadonians and show them how Ra's servant aliens are really just men in masks.
If it bleeds, we can kill it.
They launch a siege on the pyramid. In the ensuing battle, Shaori is killed. Daniel knows that Ra's sarcophagus can bring her back, though, so he travels to Ra's ship using transportation rings, while O'Neill tries to disable the Naquadah-enhanced nuke. Shaori is pretty much just a pathetic damsel in distress who adds nothing to the plot except being there for Daniel to save. Daniel and O'Neill both solve their problems as active characters, while Shaori is just passive. I won't call that a woman being stuffed in the refrigerator, though, as her death is very temporary. The audience knows well that Daniel has the opportunity to bring her back. It's more like her becoming injured than having a full narrative death. It's just another obstacle for Daniel to face. On the other hand, the death of Scar's friend is a much more emotionally heavy scene. Ra lifts his ship up into orbit at a perfect time for O'Neill to give the alien back his bomb. Ra is destroyed, while the Abadonians are freed. The soldiers prepare to go home, but much like Avatar, Daniel decides to stay on Abydos. He goes native with his native bride and high status for having helped save the day, while O'Neill promises to lie to his superiors and say that Daniel died in the attack. It's a geek-aimed version of the typical Avatar or a Princess of Mars kind of male fantasy. As such fantasies go, it's a little more feminist than one might expect. Catherine, as the call to adventure, has her quiet dignity. There's an attempt to show that there are expert female archaeologists. The first time, at least, Daniel is able to reject the marriage. And Daniel's overall portrayal legitimizes a kind of masculinity that is often degraded as feminine, for not meeting a jock kind of standard. However, there is still the intense masculine focus, the way female archaeologists don't do anything, the way the arranged marriage is ultimately depicted, the demonization of androgyny with regard to Ra, and the way Shaori has no character depth and is just there to fulfill Daniel's male hero fantasy. So that's the movie. Please like, share, subscribe, and consider donating to my Patreon. Pledges of $2 or more will earn you an explicit thank you at the end of each video. Thank you.